Welcome. I've got the company of KJ No today, and it's a privilege to have KJ with me. Welcome, KJ.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Finian.
We're going to be talking about the civil war in Myanmar, and KJ's quite an authority on that subject. By the way, KJ No has written many articles on the Asia Pacific geopolitics and political economy. He's written for a bunch of very respected outlets, including Asia Times, Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, um, several others. So KJ, it's great to have your expertise on the subject.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to have this discussion with you.
Thanks, KJ. So KJ, we are going to, as I say, we're talking about the Myanmar civil war now. Not a lot of people seem to know that there is a quite a serious, heavy war raging in that country in Southeast Asia. It borders with several other countries, principally China to the north. And for the last 3 years, there's been a very intensive war going on, civil war going on. It's quite complicated, complex conflict. Not much coverage, or clear coverage in the Western media. Um, KJ, it seems to be the military government in that country is on the back foot there. Is that correct?
I think that is correct. Yes, they have lost a lot of territory, in particular in the border regions, which are actually really critical for their trade and foreign relations. But they still continue to hold the strongholds on the lowlands in the center of Myanmar. And so I think it's a misunderstanding to think that they are vanquished by any degree.
Yeah.
Just a quick, yes.
So you think, KJ, they're not going to collapse it imminently? The military government will hold on to power.
Yeah, they're not going to collapse imminently. And I think anybody who predicts the outcome of this war really doesn't know what they're talking about. Certainly anybody who predicts the imminent collapse of the military government, the Tatmadaw, the SAC, doesn't know what they're talking about. But,
Mhm.
just to kind of give you the historical context, this is the longest running civil war in modern history. It's already been ongoing, active conflict for 76 years. And in the 3-year period since the most recent military coup, there have been probably in the range of 33,000 violent clashes, 1.5 million internally displaced peoples, 3,000 civilian deaths, and probably in the range of 30,000, combat military units. So, I mean, this is a full-scale civil war. This is,
Mhm.
the Balkans all over again.
Yeah. And recently, KJ, there's been studies in the American think tank world, like the Wilson Center, the Jamestown Foundation, who are calling for like more American United States intervention in that conflict. Do you see the United States intervening in that conflict more?
I think it already is intervening. We're seeing Western mercenaries in Myanmar. These are people who have displaced themselves from Ukraine and Syria, but are, serious, combat hardened veterans. We already see that the US has sunk $400 million into Myanmar. Primarily, they claim humanitarian aid, but it's going into all sorts of different sources. The U.S. passed the Burma Act recently. That's 136 million annually, and that includes $50 million a year to support NGOs and civil society organizations in and around Myanmar for quote unquote democracy trainings.
Mm.
And it also is in the process of supporting them with non-lethal assistance. The NUG, which is the U.S. Aligned government in exile, is asking for another $500 million a year
Mm.
for, they call it non-lethal assistance, but we're talking about, digital warfare technology, digital security. We're talking about, body armor, radar, drones and drone jamming technology.
Uh,
So, it's all dual use stuff.
yeah.
And what the US wants is they want a civilian government amenable to its will, not unlike Ukraine or Taiwan province or South Korea, etc.,
Yeah.
etc.
Just to be clear, KJ, and when you're talking about the American massive plans to massively intervene here, this is to support the groups that are opposed to the military junta, the military government, the ethnic armed organizations, the EAOs as they call them, and there's dozens of them in Myanmar. You're saying that the American government are very much dedicating their resources to boost these various paramilitary groups, these insurgents.
It's a very, very complex map, and it's not any single binary that you can name. So you have currently, let me name the players. You have the SAC and the Tatmadaw. This is the current military coup government. You have
Mhm.
the NUG, which is the government in exile. This is the former Burma majority civilian government, which was cohabiting with the military, and they were actually colluding with the military, but now they've been put into exile. So the NUG is the exile government, strongly aligned with the United States, but playing other, hands as well. They have what they refer to as the PDF, the People's Defense Forces, which are civilian resistance groups inside of Burma. And these PDFs are now starting to integrate with the armed ethnic organizations. There are over 30 armed ethnic organizations. They're ethnic militias. Some of them are incredibly powerful. Some of them produce, for example, their own munitions. They are self-sustained armies, and they have allied in different ways. It looks like the PDF is starting to ally with certain armed ethnic organizations. Now, the armed ethnic organizations I see as the key player, but they have various shifting alliances. And so it's a misunderstanding to think that they're either allied with one side or the other. They essentially have their own interests, and some of them are coming together in temporary alliances. But yes, sorry, that was a long answer. The US is trying to seek actors that it can support in order to further its own interests, including the PDF and the certain sectors or portions of armed ethnic organizations. Certainly, there's been outreach to the armed ethnic organizations and the ethnic governments that lead them.
And it seems to be quite clear, KJ, that the United States objective is to use the Myanmar conflict to destabilize China's strategic interests and quite legitimate interests. They have invested a lot of money, as you have reported in your writing. They've invested a lot of money to build up infrastructure for the Belt and Road Initiative, this very ambitious trade and transport network throughout Southeast Asia and further afield. China has invested a lot in that, and the Americans seem to be very much driven by a desire to disrupt that through the intervening in this civil war. Is that correct, KJ?
You're absolutely right. And once again, to go back into the history very briefly, you have to understand that China has a 2,000-kilometer border with Myanmar. And for decades, the US used Myanmar as a launching pad to attack and destabilize China in Yunnan province. In fact, when the Chinese Civil War ended, the KMT fascist military bifurcated. Half of it went to Taiwan Island, where it continued to attack China. And the other half, or a smaller portion of them, went to Myanmar, and they essentially created a second front against China, which was directed from Taiwan Island, directed by the United States. This war lasted for decades. And during the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, it was an active, hot conflict. You really have to understand the Korean War as a two-pronged attack against China, one from the northeast on the Korean Peninsula, and the other from, the southwest from Myanmar province. And so it has a long history of being used as a
Yes.
destabilizing force against China. Then there was a military coup. Eventually, that military coup, got rid of or tamped down some of these active, hot war against China. And then it transitioned into a dirty war for decades. And this is why we have what is called the Golden Triangle. This was the former KMT waging a dirty war and funding it through drug trafficking in that area. So it has a long history of transnational criminality. And all of that was funneled through Taiwan Island, and these drugs were funneled into Europe and the United States through Air America, which was
So,
actually the civil airline of the Taiwan authorities.
yes.
So it's a dirty, ugly history. But yes, to answer your question, the US would like to destabilize China from Myanmar. At the
Mhm.
very least, it does not want a stable, peaceful, calm, and friendly Myanmar, a Myanmar that is friendly to China.
Yeah. I mean, from what you're saying, KJ, Taiwan, the whole conflict around Taiwan is very much a piece, an extension then of what's happening in, or rather, we could put it the other way. Myanmar is an extension of the Taiwan conflict that seems to be building. Last week, Washington has pledged to send another $350 million worth of missiles and other weapons to Taiwan, one of many tranches of weapons being sent to Taiwan. So the Biden administration seems to be very much focused on using Taiwan as a point of provocation towards China. And as that builds up, you think then Myanmar will also intensify as another prong, as you put it.
It's possible. I mean, you have to understand that the US has a general plan of encircling China and trying to contain it and roll it back, literally take it down. I mean, this is very, very clear from everything that it's doing. These plans are highly advanced. They're not only waging incessant information warfare in the media, which we are constantly subjected to, but they're now shaping the environment, shaping the theater of war, and they're engaging in constant provocation. So you see the provocations in Taiwan, you see the provocations on the Korean Peninsula, you see the provocations in the South China Sea, and it would like to have another area where it can wage provocations and war, preferably on land. Now, that was originally supposed to be Xinjiang. That seems to have been undermined, but they still want a left tackle, if you will.
Yeah.
Taiwan is the centerpiece. It's the trigger. It will start the play, and then you will see other dominoes or other
Yeah.
mines go off.
You
They're
mentioned
all
you mentioned KJ. You mentioned Xinjiang there. Just to clarify, you were referring to the Uyghur alleged genocide of the Uyghurs there. I think, weren't you?
yes.
As a kind of a an overture to de or to get involved, but that seems to have kind of faded out. KJ, let me just move on then. You did mention about the information warfare that the United States and its Western allies are waging through their mainstream media. Um, Naively, people would think they're private independent media, but the corporate media very much are a propaganda function of the US government and its Western and its NATO allies. Now, KJ, can you just explain or describe what is the Western portrayal of Myanmar vis-a-vis China? I mean, and the United States. Am I right in thinking the Western media would try to portray China as some kind of villain in the piece, that it supports a dictatorial military government in Myanmar that's suppressing pro-democracy movements that are, very noble and need to be supported by the very noble ethical West? Is that correct?
Yes, that's the portrayal. I mean, there's a lot of complication to that, but the Western media portrayal is that you have the courageous, largely civilian people of Myanmar fighting for democracy against an authoritarian military state that is supported by other authoritarian states, most namely China and Russia. That is the Western portrayal. It's a complete mischaracterization of the situation. Really, the key understanding you have to come to regarding Myanmar is that it is a balkanized legacy of British colonialism that over a century and a half, perpetrated some of the worst colonial excesses and violence against the people in the region, and then created a patchwork of 135 ethnicities to create a balkanized state in order to rule and divide. Towards the end of World War II, a communist, anti-imperialist fighter by the name of Aung San, who was actually the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, tried to bring all these different ethnicities and nations together in a confederation to fight off colonization, first Japanese colonization, and then the continued or renewed British colonization. What happened was that as he was bringing the country together into a confederation, he was assassinated, and it's strongly suspected that he was assassinated by ruling British elites close to Winston Churchill, who simply did not want to let go of Myanmar. Anyway, Myanmar found its own, was quote unquote decolonized, but you could see that there was this continual feeding of weapons and support to some of the intermediary ethnic groups that had served as a kind of control strata. For example, Karen, who had been Christianized. And so this turned into a full-scale civil war that has continued to this day. You have scores of ethnic groups with militaries fighting each other, as well as fighting the military government, as well as fighting the Burma majority government. This is the current national unity government. I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that they really have national unity, because when they were cohabiting with the military government, they were just as oppressive to the ethnic minorities as the military themselves. And so it's a much, much more complex situation than the Western would have you believe. But the nutshell description is that it is a legacy of British colonialism and imperialism, and those effects are coming down to this day.
So KJ, what is China trying to achieve with its southern neighbor? What is China's role or relations with Myanmar then? I mean, how would you describe its involvement in Myanmar?
Well, China wants a stable, predictable, and neutral Myanmar at the very least. The US wants a government hostile to China in order to undermine the Belt and Road, of which the first key leg goes through Myanmar. It goes through Yunnan province, then goes through Rakhine State down to Kap Fu port. And this is one of the most important legs of the Belt and Road because it bypasses the US choke point in the South China Sea. US intends to strangle China out in the South China Sea, where $5 trillion worth of Chinese trade goes through, and 70% of its oil. By creating this leg, which is called CMEC, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, it allows China some breathing space, and it allows it to bypass the straits, the Malacca Strait, where the US has planned for war as a critical choke point.
Sounds, KJ,
yes.
from what you're saying, the critical importance of Myanmar as an alternative route for China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the stakes are really high here. I mean, if the United States, it's an ideal opportunity. I think the Wilson Center actually referred to it as a golden opportunity for the United States to intervene and to sabotage China's strategic interests of trade and investment. Uh, Conversely, China, it's crucial for for China. So the stakes are rather really extremely high here, which would suggest that it would be it's potentially a very hot point of confrontation, conflict in a proxy war where the United States is fanning the conflict.
Yes, absolutely. It's geostrategically critical both for China and the United States.
Mm,
Um, what is important to understand is that, if the United States stops its interference, then I think there is a possibility for China to work with the various parties. And China is not picking any favorites here because it's
mm,
foolish to try and pick a favorite in a crossfire hurricane. It simply wants stability on its, borders, and it wants good relations with a neighbor. But if I think the US were to stop its interference, stop its continual attempts to use Myanmar as a proxy to undermine China, and it was doing this to the tunes of millions, tens of millions, even before the coup broke out. It was
mm,
funding civil service organizations and NGOs to attack the Belt and Road. And so I think that if there is support, if China is not interfered with and given the capacity to support a peaceful resolution among the parties, then I think that there is a possibility for a good outcome for
mm.
Myanmar.
But the
Though,
Western, but
yes,
KJ, sorry to jump in on you. I'm just conscious of the time ticking away here. But if the Western media pursue this fanciful notion, this propaganda narrative that the civil war in Myanmar is a good guy against a bad guy, and China's with the bad guys, and the United States and its NATO allies are with the good guys. I mean, if they continue to promulgate that narrative, it makes it harder for the United States then to withdraw or to do some, have a more reasonable policy because it's kind of like amplifying a notion or a moral imperative to intervene in Myanmar to support the good guys, the pro-democracy.
you're absolutely right. But remember, the US never intervenes for moral reasons. It's always geostrategic, it's always self-interested, it's always for furthering the aims of capitalism and imperialism. And so it will use that pretext. And this is the language that is being used right now. But of course, that won't help. Now, this is not to say that the military is not, committing tremendous atrocities. That certainly has to be opposed. And certainly we have to do everything humanly possible to find a peaceful outcome. The suffering on the ground by the people is real and
Mm,
tangible. But the fact that the US seeks to weaponize it to further its own geostrategic ends is not going to improve any of the outcomes.
mm,
Certainly, I mean, all we have to do is look around the world and understand that that in and of itself is a fool's errand. And the
mm,
groups that are seeking US support in order to get a better outcome, I think they're misguided.
mm. KJ, just to reiterate, so the Western media certainly are giving a very distorted view of the conflict in Myanmar in a way that makes it very difficult to resolve in a peaceful way because of their distorted project, image projection of the conflict. You would say.
I absolutely agree. This is not a binary. It's like a game with 50 different players, and each one of them has a different interest and a different outcome that they intend. And if you try and impose a simple binary, good versus evil, or democracy versus authoritarianism framework, you're going to get the entire picture wrong. I
Mm,
think that is completely, and furthermore, it's completely dishonest because at the end of the day, the US wants to use Myanmar to destabilize and attack China.
mm,
And that there is no way that that can have good outcomes. already we see that these outcomes have been bad. Remember, Aung San Suu Kyi herself was supposed to be the Western proxy. She was supposed to implement neoliberalism in Myanmar, essentially, deliver the country to Western multinationals that were salivating over teak and fossil fuels and jade and minerals and strategic, metals. That's what she was supposed to do. Instead, what she did was she wasn't allying, but she was opening relations with China at the same time that she was balancing, for example, with the Taiwan authorities. The US didn't want that. They wanted the whole hog. And so that's when they started a process of delegitimating her, taking her to the ICC, hauling her in front of the
Mm,
UNS, etc. And then
mhm,
that created a weakness in her government that allowed the military government, the Tatmadaw, to reclaim power because it was not happy with the cohabitation.
mm,
And then that created this entire explosion where all the ethnic armed organizations and everybody who had a grudge or an interest exploded back into a very, very complex civil war.
yeah. Are you saying, KJ, that the United States has more responsibility for the coup in 2021, the February 2021 coup that deposed Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government? Are you saying that the Americans actually have more responsibility for that than, say, China, which the Western media would tend to insinuate?
Yeah, China had nothing to do with the coup. They had good relations with the existing civilian government.
Hmm.
So they had no reason for a coup. But the US created the conditions for the coup by
Hmm.
undermining the civilian government, which then the military government saw as an opportunity that the US could no longer defend the civilian government. So they created a breach. The military government took advantage of that. And it was a very flawed election already. People
Hmm.
say the voting itself was fine, but what happened before the election, where vast numbers of ethnic minority regions were prevented from voting completely, that was illegitimate. And
Hmm.
so the Tatmadaw saw an opportunity, they took it, and then when there was civil resistance, they reacted strongly, and then that created, counter resistance on the part of both the civilian governments, but also it created a breach for the armed ethnic organizations to start to reclaim territories and centers of power. And so it really, I think, this chaos, I think you can really lay on the enabling factor for this chaos was U.S. Policy of wanting everything. It wanted a completely pliable Myanmar
Hmm.
to its cause, and when it didn't get that, it pulled the plug on its proxy, which then opened a door for
Right.
the military
Right.
to come back, and everything
Yeah.
else came from
Yeah.
that.
Well, China, at the start of this year, January, they organized they sponsored a peace summit in Kunming, the provincial capital of Yunnan province that borders with Myanmar. They sponsored a peace summit with the various parties. So just to kind of corroborate what you're saying, KJ, that China does seem to be trying to resolve the conflict in a pluralist way with the various parties. Um, but in a nutshell, KJ, and we're going to have to wrap it up here, but in a nutshell, what needs to happen for Myanmar to the people of Myanmar to realize to finally achieve some kind of peaceful settlement, peace in their country that has been going the peace has been wrecked for over 70 years, as you eloquently put it, by the British colonial legacy. What needs to happen, KJ, for the Myanmar people to achieve some kind of peaceful, prosperous society?
I think they need to sit down and start to negotiate with each other without Western interference or Western prompting or money or I think there's a very strong corrupting influence of U.S. geostrategic interests on the various parties. I think that China has put forth and is trying to mediate a process of stabilization for the entire country. And I think if the parties can come together in a neutral fashion, and I believe that China has credibility with all the parties as a neutral broker, as neutral as can be in this situation. If they engage in meaningful dialogue, I think there is a possibility for peaceful resolution. And that peaceful resolution will probably look like some kind of confederated state, which had been the original dream of Aung San. Now, it will not be that confederated state, will not be a US proxy. And that's what the US does not want. It wants a reliable proxy on the border against China. And that is the confounding element that I think we have to be very careful about.
KJ New, it was a pleasure and a delight to hear your expertise, your knowledge on a part of the world that should be looked at more, or more, people should be more aware of what's going on in this civil war. So, KJ, thank you so much. KJ No writes for Asia Times, Dissident Voice, Counterpunch, various other outlets, and I hope you follow up on his writings. KJ, I'll put a link into your work in this interview. So thank you very much, KJ.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.